سيداتي وسادتي، ستبدأ الآن الجلسة الثالثة تحت عنوان التنوع والانقسام في الولايات المتحدة، إعادة تعريف دورها العالمي. Ladies and gentlemen, panel 3 entitled Red, White, and Blue, Reimagining America's Global Role will start now.
Hello. Hey, everybody. I'm Steve Clemons. I'm contributing editor of the National Interest, and I am a fan of Ebtisam at Kebi, and I have enjoyed being here every year, I think, since the beginning, and having a spicy conversation. Usually I'm with Andrei Kortunov and Cliff Kupchan, but this year they gave me America. So let's start out and have a little fun before we get going here. I know some of you do vote in America. Some of you may secretly vote in America, but don't tell me about that. But many of you are America watchers, you're world watchers, but you watch and you paid attention to many of the elections around the world that have happened. Over 4 billion people were making choices about their governance around the world. But the US election was a big one. And I'm just interested, we don't have everybody in here, but don't tell me who you supported. But how many of you thought Kamala Harris was going to pull this out and win? Throw your hand up. My friend from Iran. How many of you thought Donald Trump was going to win? So overwhelming. So for you, at least, this election was not much of a surprise. Let me figure out what my American friends here think. We have with us for this discussion Red, White, and Blue, Reimagining America's Global Role, my good friend Jim Lindsay. He's the Mary and David Boyce Distinguished Senior Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, the longtime Director of Studies at the CFR. And we have Gregory Gause, who's the Professor of International Affairs, and the John Lindsay, unrelated Lindsay, 44 Chair at the Bush School of Government and Public Policy at Texas A&M University. We're going to have a fireside chat. And I want to take a lot of questions. So we may even weave your questions in here earlier than we have, because I want to be more interesting for all of you than lunch coming ahead. But let me just start out, and I want to ask a kind of facetious question, but not so much, Jim. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it that a state dinner will be held in Vladimir Putin's honor in the White House in the next 4 years?
3.
Gregory?
7.
7. So I say that because if you went into most, I would call strategic class discussions in New York or Washington, I think many people are not ready for that, even beyond a 1 possibility. So Jim, tell me a little bit more, you know, as you kind of look at the dashboard of America's equities in the world, its role in the world. We go back to that old political science tension between continuity and discontinuity. Mm-hmm. Why don't we get rid of the continuity? What are going to be the big discontinuities?
Well, Donald Trump is going to be the big discontinuity.
Yeah.
I think he has made it very clear he has a very different view of America's role in the world than past presidents. And he has, for a very long time, going back to the 1980s, been critical of what I guess we could loosely call American global leadership. The idea that America advances its security and its prosperity by leading others, by building an alliance system. His argument has been that in many ways America's friends, partners, and allies are more of a threat to the United States than its adversaries. And his argument is that on the one hand, our friends, partners, and allies are quite happy to ride on the coattails of American military power. And while they're doing that, they're busy taking jobs away from the American people. And that's his worldview. And I would expect going forward, he will act on those views.
I mean, let me just underscore that. Donald Trump has been basically saying America being engaged in the world has resulted in Americans getting ripped off.
Yes,
right?
Go back to September 2nd, 1987.
Yeah.
Full page ad, New York Times, Boston Globe, Washington Post. laid it out there. The only real difference is maybe changing the names of some of the countries.
So, Greg, what does that mean for allies and friends of the United States? Can they depend on the United States? Can they depend on a Donald Trump-led White House? Can they pay more for affection?
They can certainly always pay more for affection, but I think it's going to differ from place to place. I think the European allies are the...
How is the Gulf going to do?
The Gulf's going to do okay.
Okay.
I do think that the Gulf countries, one of the most interesting things about this election, as opposed to the last two, is the Gulf hasn't been an issue. All right. President Biden campaigned in 2020 saying Saudi Arabia was a pariah. Right. There was none of that in this election. And I think that the Gulf states will be just fine. And I think that there's actually a bit more of a consensus in Washington on the need for good relations with the Gulf states. However, I think people in the Gulf are going to be very worried about the increase in, or the return to a maximum pressure policy on Iran. Because we know what the maximum pressure policy led to in the first Trump administration, which was the attacks on the Saudi oil facilities in September of 2019. And I think that folks in the Gulf these days are much less interested in a confrontational policy toward Iran and are much more worried about being dragged into an Iranian-Israeli conflict, an Iranian-American conflict.
Well, let me ask you a question. When we talk about maximum pressure, I'm going to try and ask this carefully, and because I'm asking it doesn't necessarily mean I believe it. But if you're a superpower in the world, there's kind of a mystique to it. You don't have to go fight a battle every day. It's just the world has seen over decades, you know, an ability of a superpower to pull rabbits out of the hat, to create miracles, to have a strong economy, to be able to deploy power. But it's not like you're fighting everywhere. So that mystique is very, very important. In my mind, I'm wondering if we're at a moment where American mystique as a superpower is being shorn off. And it's having to prove itself in ways it has never been before. It's seeing China fill in a lot of the gaps. And I mean, I just want to be honest. Walking around this room and people out there having coffee, I bet there's a lot more doubt about America's place in the world right now than there used to be. So what would America need to do to actually put together maximum pressure? I don't think it can like it used to, but tell me where I'm wrong.
So it seems to me that the most important element of a maximum pressure policy is access to world financial markets and tertiary sanctions on, third-party actors who might want to deal with Iran, but don't want to give up their access to the American financial system, to the American economic system. And I think that the Trump administration, if you will, weaponized access to SWIFT, which we heard in the last panel, and other elements of the global financial system to really hurt Iran economically. I don't think the Iranians hit Abqaiq and Kharis, the Saudi oil facilities, if they weren't really feeling the pressure. And so there's that element added to, of course, the military element. And we've heard, I think, on numerous occasions today even, that the Trump administration, this new Trump administration, will be reluctant to get involved in military conflicts. And I think that that's true generally. But I also think that when it comes to Iran, because of the close American relationship with Israel, and also, and I don't want to exaggerate this, but Mr. Trump is very personal. And the recent reports that there was some kind of Iranian plan to try to assassinate him, yep. I think it's going to affect his view of Iran going forward.
Jim, when it comes to managing the superpower portfolio of the United States, is creating an Iran-centric focus as your North Star in foreign policy all that matters?
Well, I don't think the Trump administration is going to have an Iran-centric foreign policy. And it's probably useful to take a step back and acknowledge that whoever would have won last week is going to inherit a foreign policy inbox that is full of thorny, difficult, complicated problems that don't bear easy solutions. Striking thing on the campaign trail is that Donald Trump talked a lot about how if he had been president, these problems would not have materialized. He didn't really lay out an agenda for how he would deal with them. And we still don't know how he will deal with them. And he's put some pretty big markers down there. He wants to bring the war in Gaza to a halt before he becomes president. He wants to bring the war in Ukraine to a halt before he becomes president. He's going to rectify America's economic imbalances with the rest of the world when he's president. I will just suggest that these may all be lofty goals, but they're very difficult to achieve. It's not as if the Biden administration didn't resolve these issues simply because it wasn't paying attention.
You said something really important a minute ago that is just that Donald Trump himself is a very different mindset, a very different approach. I'll tell our audience that there's actually a useful book for this time written long, long ago by Walter Russell Mead, you know well, called Special Providence. And in that book, he looks at sort of 4 models of presidential framing, if you will. The Hamiltonian, kind of a neo-mercantilist school. The Jeffersonian, a more agrarian, like let's all just get along school. Wilsonian, values more than interest. But the one that really struck me in Walter Mead's book was the Jacksonian school. And if you read that and look at it, it is the definition of pugnacious nationalism, right? So what we're talking about today, about America's role in the world, is the tension between globalization, as it used to be. I think it's dead now, but globalization versus pugnacious nationalism. And this Jacksonian school is, hey, we don't want to be in your mess, but if you kind of hit us or you harm us, watch out, we'll rain hell on your head, and then we'll pull back. Is that largely, would you say that defines Donald Trump?
There's a lot there, and I don't want to oversell it. I would note that if you hit us, by us I mean the United States itself, I think it is true. If you mean hit other countries that are important to the United States, it may not be true. And Greg pointed out one example.
So Europe's in trouble.
Well, potentially the Middle East is in trouble.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we should not exaggerate Donald Trump's willingness to unleash American military force. But I think it's sort of an overarching challenge for American foreign policy going forward. It was alluded to and I think somewhat dismissed in the previous panel, and that is the growing cooperation among China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. It is significant. It is in economics. It is in diplomacy. It is in military. It is in technology and elsewhere. It's often labeled the axis of autocracies or the quartet of chaos or the axis of the aggrieved. You can go on. There are lots of contending names for it. But the reality is that we're seeing increasing bilateral, not multilateral, cooperation among these countries that is significant. And it is frustrating American foreign policy objectives around the world. The most obvious one would be the case of the war in Ukraine. The United States clearly wants Ukraine to win, or at least to hold on to its territory. And the fact that Iranian, North Korean, and Chinese support has enabled Russia to carry out a war in Ukraine that otherwise would not be able to do so. So the question then becomes, actually really 2 questions. One, what is the future of this alignment? It's not an alliance, but it's certainly an alliance of convenient or overlapping interest. But also, what is the proper American strategy for dealing with it? We don't really have a good sense. One just final point, really important to stress. The Walter Russell Mead notion of presidential leadership focuses our attention on presidents. But presidents are not the only ones who get a say in this. What's going to matter a lot is who do they surround themselves with. And with Donald Trump, there's a great big question mark as to who is going to staff his national security team, what do they believe, and how well will they work with each other. And that's something we're going to see unfold over the next several weeks. But there's just a lot about the Trump administration that we don't know, and I understand there was a natural tendency to want to fill in the blanks, but this may be a time to actually wait and get a bit more information before we start drawing out hard and fast conclusions about what is going to happen.
Gregory, there are a couple of wars out there the United States is helping to supply resources to. Of course, the Ukraine conflict, and of course many European allies and supporters there. And then we've heard in the last session with Dr. Gause and others talking about the Gaza crisis in Israel and now Lebanon, more broadly in the U.S. Major weapons supporter there. Are these conflicts and how they come out defining conflicts for the United States right now, where if it abandons them, it sends a signal about America's role in the world? If it stays with them, it sends an American signal about, I'm just wondering, as Big Brzezinski would say, there's some challenges in the world that have become so important because they define the way the rest of the world perceives us. Donald Trump doesn't seem to care very much about either one of these conflicts, but should the United States care about them?
I would really distinguish between Ukraine and Gaza. I think that what happens in Ukraine is going to have significant geopolitical consequences going forward. And if you think, as many, many people in Washington do, one of the few bipartisan things in Washington these days, that competition with China is the single most defining issue for American foreign policy going forward. If you lose Europe, if Europe becomes not a partner of the United States, but kind of a floating player on the world scene, you've basically damaged yourself enormously if you're looking to compete with China. I think the Gaza question is much more driven by American domestic politics. I don't think that there's really any long-term strategic fundamental interest for the United States in what happens in Gaza, which is not to minimize the human tragedy that's occurring in Gaza. But in terms of strategic interest, Gaza is not that important. Ukraine is. And so I do think that there's a real difference there. But the drivers on Gaza, I think, are largely American domestic politics.
So was this election won or lost by either of the candidates on foreign policy? Did foreign policy really weigh in when you look at the results of this election? Or are we just, seeing the results of two different profiles? I mean, was the price of eggs and butter and milk and steak, were they a bigger driver of the outcome? I think it's interesting to know whether foreign policy really, very different views of foreign policy, whether that was really in the minds of Americans when they voted or not. What's your sense, Greg?
My sense is that there's no specific foreign policy issue that was significant in explaining this outcome. But I do think that the Trump campaign played on an idea that the Biden administration had lost control of events, lost control of the border, lost control of prices, and lost control of stability in the world. And I'm extremely skeptical of the notion that none of this would have happened if Donald Trump had been president. But that is something that and the out party can always campaign on. It's the in party's fault.
Do you think Donald Trump's Secretary of Defense could disappear for a while in the hospital without Donald Trump knowing?
I'm not even sure that Donald Trump will know who his defense secretary is on most days.
Okay, that may be fair. Yeah. But it is interesting when it comes down again to command control, foreign policy, national security, Jim. Lloyd Austin disappeared. He had a health challenge, disappeared. The president didn't know. It raised really interesting questions about Biden's competence and his awareness of what I think it really damaged him. What do you think?
Well, I think if we're talking about things that damaged Joe Biden's competence or the perception of his competence, it was the way the United States withdrew from Afghanistan.
Right.
And I think quite clearly, if you look at American public opinion polling, that's when Joe Biden's approval ratings plummeted and they never really recovered. But I do think, that there is certainly a narrative out there, and I think we've heard it from some of our Chinese friends here, but we certainly hear it elsewhere, which is that the United States is in decline, that the United States and the West more generally is in decline, and in Asia is on the rise. That's something that Xi Jinping has said a number of times. Vladimir Putin has popped in as well. I actually agree with the way Greg framed the issue about foreign policy in the election. I think it may be a contributing factor to a sense that the Biden administration or the Biden-Harris administration wasn't sort of up to the task, but it really was a secondary or tertiary factor. This really turned on the fact that a lot of Americans were very unhappy about the state of the economy. It's clear in all of our opinion. I think also on the issue of the border. But I want to just sort of stress, even though the Republicans won the trifecta, or at least it looks like they've won the trifecta, taken the presidency, taking the Senate, taking the House, this election by no means was a landslide. Indeed, if you were to look at Donald Trump's election in terms of the popular vote margin over the last 8 elections, it's either 5th or 6th. Out of the last 8 elections. So this wasn't Ronald Reagan, 1984, 59% of the vote, 500 electoral college.
No, but the way it was a landslide, metaphorically, was Donald Trump has never gotten above 50% on anything.
And he might not yet get above 50%. We haven't finished counting the
well, I
votes.
think it's pretty
it'll,
close.
It'll be a near thing. But putting it aside,
yeah.
it actually didn't really matter because my sense is Donald Trump will govern as if it is a landslide, as if he has a mandate from the American public. And this is why, in terms of American domestic politics, in 6 or 12 months, we could be in a very different place than that, because certainly the policies that many of Donald Trump's supporters want him to enact are deeply unpopular with the United States, which takes us to the question of all the things that Donald Trump spoke of that he was going to do. The real question is, how far is he going to go? How fast is he going to go? And how furious will he be when he does it? Because you could tell a story in which he's actually going to be able to pull off many of the major things that he has promised. But it's also easy to imagine a situation in which they bite off too much, create too much chaos, and find themselves much like the Biden administration did in their first year, seeing their poll results begin to head south.
Look, I think the biggest change in the topography of America's foreign policy world is the overlay of economics as a key concern. And in that, I throw AI, I throw quantum, I throw semiconductor chips, I throw, a lot of these kind of next generation
Are you going to throw tariffs in there?
What's that?
You're going to throw tariffs in there?
Well, I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
But it raises the question when you think about, again, coming back to this question of trying to forestall, if you're a U.S. White House, trying to forestall the perception of American decline, and you're recognizing China's and India's, candidly, unbelievable growth and success in a number of these cutting-edge technologies. America has now become a big industrial policy believer, which is, I don't know, Jim, it's kind of new for me.
Well, no, I would say
but
the Democrats have become, it's not clear Republicans have become big believers.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of the questions I have to ask you is, will the CHIPS investments that have happened, will the big hand of government and investment that's a very new feature be something that is continuous because it's designed to essentially compete with China? Will that be something that Donald Trump will keep his hand in? Does that create both opportunities and obstacles in America's engagement with Europe and other parts of the world?
Well, there's an awful lot there. Let me make us 3 quick comments. One, the United States economy is remarkably robust. It's growing at nearly 3% right now. And in that sense, if you look around the rest of the world, it's a shining star. If you think, secondly, about innovation, the United States is at the cutting edge of all kinds of innovation. That's not to say that India and China aren't making great strides. They are. But I would not argue that somehow the United States is, Great Britain circa 1960, somehow falling far behind. And I think the third thing going forward is going to be the question of what exactly is Donald Trump going to do on his economic policy, because it ties to the strategic policy, it ties to our alliance structure, and much, much more. Certainly, Donald Trump gave the impression on the campaign trail that he's going to go after the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the worst named bills ever coming out of the United States Congress, because he doesn't like it, because it's Joe Biden's shining accomplishment. What he's going to discover is that this act, which no Republican voted for, is going to be strongly defended by governors in red states, because that's where a lot of the money went. It's going to be a big fight over that. But the bigger issue is going to be, does Donald Trump move forward on the very ambitious tariff plan that he has laid out? Because I think that, Greg mentioned transatlantic relations. We heard some discussion about transatlantic relations earlier today. That is going to really roil one of America's most significant strategic relationships.
Greg, your thoughts on tariffs? And I'll say tariffs plus his immigration policies, which I think are very much designed around addressing essentially white working class or all working class people, driving wages up, cutting off the inflow of people into America, and protecting industries.
Well, short answer, I'm against it. So I'm not a good representative for what's about to come. But it does seem to me that President Trump is mostly transactional on almost every policy issue, but he has a few fixed ideas.
Right.
One of those fixed ideas is that tariffs are good, multilateral trade agreements are bad, bilateral trade agreements are all about getting a better deal vis-a-vis the people who are across the table from you, and that tariffs are the way America can get those better deals. And this goes to competitors like China, it goes to allies like the European countries. It will go to Canada and Mexico, with which the United States is tied into a free trade agreement. I don't think that President Trump particularly cares about that. And then immigration, right? Immigration is a domestic political issue that will enormously impact our relations with Latin American countries, Mexico, Central America in particular, to the negative. But will also, both of these things, tariffs and the idea of mass deportation, are going to enormously increase prices and inflation in the United States.
So what does that do to the American, to get back to the topic, the American foreign policy brand?
I think it harms it. But as I said, I was on the other side in this election, and I think that these policy implications are pretty clear, but I don't think that will stop the Trump administration from moving in these directions.
I just want to jump in here on the issue of tariffs. I agree with what Greg laid out, but I want to suggest that there's another possibility here. I do think if you look at Trump first term, he viewed tariffs as a way to gain leverage. You impose tariffs, you have leverage, you negotiate a bilateral deal, and then the end result is that it's good for American exporters. I'm not so sure that's the mindset that Donald Trump is taking into what will be his second administration. What is remarkable about Donald Trump over the last year is how he has talked about tariffs, which he says is the most beautiful word in the English language. I personally disagree. I don't know many people who think of tariffs as the most beautiful word in the English language, be that as it may. So he talks about it really in this notion of putting a ring around the American economy and using tariffs as a way to force foreign producers to relocate to the United States. That's a very different conception. That's why he keeps invoking William McKinley. I never for the life of me thought I would have an American presidential candidate looking back fondly on the 1890s. The 1890s were a period of high tariffs. They were also a period of not just one, but two depressions in the United States, in part because of tariff policy, mostly because of monetary policy, or lack thereof. So Trump, I think, is just a very different view. And so this gets us the question, who is Trump going to staff himself with? One of the people to look at is, where does Robert Lighthizer end up in this administration if he does at all? Former USTR, he wrote a piece November 1 in the Financial Times where he laid out his vision that it is time to go to tariffs, to basically use tariffs, not to get the Chinese to buy more soybeans, but to force foreign manufacturers to relocate to the United States, to rebuild our industrial capacity, and to create jobs. Now, we can argue about whether that is something that would actually work in practice, but I think that what most everybody, certainly most economists would agree, if you go down this road, it's going to be significant economic turmoil, because there's going to be retaliation from others.
But let's
it takes
just
a while to build an
industry. I probably am more comfortable with tariffs than you guys are, but with Bob
Why are you
Lighthizer,
comfortable with tariffs?
What's
Tell me
that?
Why are you comfortable with tariffs?
Because Bob Lighthizer and I worked together 30 years ago when I was at the Economic Strategy Institute, and we were worried that PNTR for China on a developing nation status would lead to the hollowing out of American industry and manufacturing. So you got disruption that we went through that I think hollowed out America, disheartened America. And I tell you, the biggest thing that's impacted foreign policy is that American middle-class families kind of believed at one point that America being a guarantor in the world somehow benefited them. They believe now they fought the Cold War and somehow China won. And I think in that mix, the quid pro quo between America being involved in the world and American middle-class families thinking they're getting something is broken. So that's where it comes together.
I agree with that diagnosis.
And I think tariffs, limited, bought-in ways to create onshoring, help create that.
Okay.
And
I would actually argue that trade is actually way down the list of things that led to the hollowing out of America. Our tax policy did, our refusal to invest in the United States, in infrastructure, in education. the financialization of our economy. And what's interesting, if you
technological change,
which
erased so many factory jobs.
And again, read the Lighthizer piece. He actually acknowledges these things, but he makes it sound as if those are secondary or tertiary. Those are the primary factors. But again, in terms of domestic politics, it's much more successful and appealing to say the problem isn't us, isn't the decisions that we made, it's them, those people who are treating us
if
unfairly.
you're Mohammed bin Zayed and you're sitting in Abu Dhabi, or you're Mohammed bin
I'm not
Salman,
worried
you're
about
sitting in
tariffs.
Riyadh. No, but I'm just saying, if you're sitting around the world, if you're Xi Jinping, if you're Vladimir Putin, and you're looking at the terrain, and I'm not saying any of these people are alike, but you're just looking at America's choices right now, its decisions it's making, and this clear vector that pugnacious nationalism of some kind is here. How are you going to react to the United States? Are you going to hedge your bets? Are you going to trust? I mean, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, take this region. Take the UAE. I mean, with all due respect, I think UAE is one of the most interesting strategic players in the world because it's hedging its bets all the way around. It's a friend to everybody. But I mean, what do you think, Jim?
Well, I think this is going to be the big question. To what extent countries want to hedge their bets will be able to hedge their bets. And I'm not really sure what it is that the Trump administration may ask. I mean, certainly we've seen of the Biden administration a desire that the UAE become less dependent upon China for technology. But I mean, there's just so much more that's at play. And again, my sort of wonderment at the present moment is that it seems like most leaders in this part of the world were quite happy to see Donald Trump win. They preferred Donald Trump to Kamala Harris, and I can understand the reasons why. But as I look at Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, look at Turkey, look at Israel, their interests don't align. And it's not clear to me that the Trump administration is going to be able to satisfy everybody. And I'd be very sort of curious. I mean, Greg knows the region much more than I do, whether there's some way to thread sort of the competing differences. And the notion that, I find it hard to believe that the Trump administration is going to make it a priority to bring the war in Gaza to an end and produce a Palestinian state. That, as best I can tell, the Israeli prime minister is dead set opposed to, as are significant factors in his governing coalition. But this is really more Greg's area of expertise.
So if I'm Vladimir Putin, I'm very happy that Trump won the election. If I'm Xi Jinping,
He's going to get a state dinner.
Yeah, well, 70% chance.
Yeah.
If I'm Xi Jinping, I think I worry about America no matter who's going to be president. But if I'm in the Gulf states, I think that I had some nostalgia for the first Trump administration, but also I had a lot of disappointments in the first Trump administration. Particularly given the fact that the Trump administration kind of led me on, if I'm a Gulf state leader, into a policy of opposition to Iran, and then when push came to shove, didn't act. And I go back to September of 2019 and the Iranian attacks on the Saudi oil facilities.
Abraham Accords, net positive or net negative?
For whom?
For Arab states and the region.
Look, I think that they're a net neutral for the United States because these were not agreements between Arab states and Israel. These were agreements between Arab states and the United States, right? They did nothing to get at one of the core, not the only, but one of the core issues in the region, which is the Palestinian issue, which we'll have a whole panel on and will be part of the discussions for all of us going forward. But look, I think anything that brings Israel into the region as a normal country is good for the region, good for the United States, good for the world. But that can't happen unless there's some kind of movement toward Palestinian self-determination. And while we all talk about a two-state solution, and it became the fallback position of so many actors after the October 7th, 2023 attacks, in fact, the likelihood of a two-state solution is very, very low because the Israeli political system has moved against it. There's very little leadership in the Palestinian community that accepts the idea of a two-state solution right now. The United States lost the historic chance to push for a two-state solution in the late 1990s, the end of the Clinton administration, where we held most of the cards. The changes on the world scene make it less likely that we move in that direction. So unfortunately, I don't see.
Let me ask you both a question here, and I'm going to be careful how I do this on our audience. I spend a lot of time, as much time as I can, with people who aren't middle-aged white guys in America, because I want to know how the younger generation looks at foreign policy. And I have to tell you, there's a generational change. They don't know the Cold War. They have no memory of the Cold War. The Israel-Gaza crisis to them looks like a social justice issue. If you go to Atlanta, you meet with a group of black leaders there. They don't know anything about foreign policy. Some of them do, but most of them don't. But for them, it's an issue of race, social justice, and other issues. You go into college campuses over the Israel-Gaza crisis. It's a different dimension there, where it's not a Council on Foreign Relations framed debate. And I just want to raise that because all of that matters with regards to America's election as well. And you could really feel it in the tension over how Joe Biden was defining the world. And this disconnect, particularly with younger Democrats, but I also think younger people across the board. So I just want to talk about that internal dynamic that as we sit in the strategic debate here in Abu Dhabi, or we're talking with a strategic class at the Council on Foreign Relations crowd, do we need to push reset more aggressively? Because there's this subterranean tension over these equities in foreign policy that just don't match where, I think domestic drivers of foreign policy are really important, and I think most Americans don't buy what Washington is selling. Jim?
Wow, big question. We could discuss this for hours. I actually think most
Maybe
Americans...
2 minutes.
Okay. I actually disagree with the premise of the question.
Go ahead.
I think the vast majority of Americans are totally checked out or never checked into a conversation about foreign policy for the United States. I think it is a big mistake to look at Columbia University or Yale University or Harvard University or the University of Michigan and draw inferences about what young people are thinking. Those are outliers. I think, again, for the most part, Americans are really focused on issues at home and have a real inability to understand or process or interest in. And I'll just go back to the issue of tariffs. The reason Donald Trump could say repeatedly that Americans wouldn't have to pay for tariffs is because most Americans don't understand what a tariff is.
Right.
Okay? And so what's really interesting, if you do polling and you ask Americans, do you think we should do tariffs? They go 2 thumbs up. You say, are you willing to do tariffs if countries are going to impose tariffs on American goods? Support goes down. If you ask them, what if you impose tariffs and it turns out your prices are going to be higher? Goes down even further. There's a real problem, and I don't know whether a current generation American knows less about the world than it did before, but there's something to be said that we may have a lot more sources of information in the United States.
So that's actually a
but
very
we're less
interesting
informed.
response. And you may be right on that. I think I do spend time with young people who are interested in foreign policy, and I still see a generational change. But what are your sense? How is it at Texas A&M?
So let's be clear about a couple of things. First off, Donald Trump did much better with the youth vote in this election than he did in 2020. Didn't win it. Harris won the youth vote, but by a much smaller margin than Joe Biden did in 2020. Okay, so there's not a fundamental.
Let's just be clear. I don't think Kamala Harris beat Joe Biden in any category or performed better than Joe Biden did.
White college-educated women.
What's that?
White college-educated women.
She went up. Okay.
At least according to the immediate exit polls. Okay. I don't think that we should leave our friends here in the Gulf with the impression that American public opinion has fundamentally shifted on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, right? But within the Democratic Party, I think there is the beginning of a shift on the Palestinian issue, and it's generational. Right? Steve, I think you're absolutely right that these students at these elite universities, many of whom will go on to become the foreign policy cadre of the Democratic Party, do view the Palestinian issue much more in the light of issues of self-determination, issues of human rights, issues of national rights, right? I don't see that in the Republican Party. I think in the Republican Party, there's been a profound shift in the American party system on the Arab-Israeli question, right? When Jim and I were growing up, the Republicans were kind of the pro-Arab party, kind of, and the Democrats were the pro-Israeli party. That's shifted, right? Because fundamentalist and evangelical Protestant Christians in the United States have become very attached to Israel and to the right-wing Israeli view of what should go on in the Holy Land. Whereas in the Democratic Party, you're beginning to see, especially in these the younger cadres and in the new generation, a willingness to question what had been a kind of a Joe Biden-style reflexive support for Israel in any crisis in the Middle East. And I don't want to leave the impression that this change is going to immediately affect American policy, but I think over the next 2 decades it will have an impact.
Also, just add here, I agree with everything that Greg just laid out, that in Democratic circles, both at older ages and younger demographics, there has been a backlash against these protests on elite college campuses. And what's interesting is that sort of assessments of Israel have become more positive over the last 6 to 12 months. And a lot of it is fueled by what they see as the misbehavior happening on college campuses. And this gets tied up to part of the reason why Donald Trump did well among younger Americans, the sense that political correctness or wokeness has really sort of choked off the debate, and that people are afraid of speaking their mind because the righteous people on the left will cancel them. And I think that is actually, when you think about the election that just transpired, it was, I think, an important factor. It would be hard to measure, but I think that drove a lot of people's assessments. The Democrats don't believe in free speech, the ability to sort of state your own opinion in what have you, that they're just basically a bunch of sanctimonious cranks who are always looking someone that they can sort of point the finger at and say, you fail our moral threshold.
I want to ask you about energy and the kind of
I
impact.
have none.
What was that?
I have none.
You have none. I want to ask you about energy and the role of energy in kind of defining America's place in the world as well, and the kind of scramble for energy. And you can look at it, and the IRA may have been badly named, the Inflation Reduction Act, folks, but Senator Manchin, who played a good role in that, defined it as an energy security bill, not a renewable energy bill. Joe Biden kept calling it, and Kamala Harris, a renewable energy process. Manchin defined it as an energy security bill, arguing that Russia had weaponized energy in ways that had not happened before, that our allies needed to be backstopped. Lots of things were happening. And I'm just sort of interested in the energy connection then to climate, right? So Joe Biden is not going to COP. Kind of wonder if any American president is ever going to go to COP again. Yeah. So when you look at that tension between energy, environment, climate, how discontinuous is the future going to be there? Gregory?
So first off, I think we have to recognize that America weaponized energy a long, long time ago in international politics. In many ways, the United States was the country that kept more oil off the market than any other country in the world, because of sanctions on Iran, because of sanctions on Libya under Gaddafi, because of the most draconian regime of sanctions in the post-World War II period on Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Major oil producers all, right? Sanctions on Venezuela. The United States has kept an enormous amount of oil off the world market. And the United States has become, in the last 10 years, the world's leading producer of oil. Not because of policy issues, but because of technological change and the fracking revolution. Fracking invented by a petroleum engineer from Texas A&M. So just to put my university up there. Any Aggies in the crowd?
It's at least one.
Yeah. Gig 'em Aggies. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that energy has always been a political tool for the United States.
Right.
Now, how does that play in for folks here in the Gulf? I think that a president who comes in and says, drill, baby, drill, is going to be the core of his energy policy has to be somewhat worrying to people in the Gulf for whom the price of oil is still a major driver of their local economies and is an essential element to their transitional plans. Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia relies upon a relatively high price of oil in order to fund the transition to an economy that will be less dependent on oil. So I think that drill baby drill is something that folks in the region should worry about. The other thing that people in the region should worry about is, and I'll come back to Jim's favorite topic, tariffs, right? To the extent that the Trump administration carries through on the promises of the campaign, right? To vastly increase tariffs on Chinese imports to the United States and to increase tariffs on other imports, 20% across the board is what President Trump was talking about. That will lead to a slowdown in global economic growth, which will lead to a slowdown in demand for oil.
Yep.
Jim?
I was just going to ask Greg, my sense is, we discussed this earlier, that with fracking, the sort of the price you have to hit per barrel to stay in business has actually fallen over time.
I think that, yeah, fracking is, back in Texas, you know, there's plenty of fracked fields that are economical at $30 a barrel.
But I would ask more along the lines of the U.S. playing a leading role with other global leaders in responding on global climate concerns and climate. Is that done? Is that over? Is there
For the next
done.
4 years, yeah, it's done.
It's done for 4 years. I mean, day one, we're going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement again.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at. I want to begin going to questions to all of you, and I'm going to ask my friend Ebtisam to begin taking a look at who we have lined up here. But as we do this, let me ask you, you know, also just real quick to come back to our friend Vladimir Putin. You know, Andrei Kortunov's in the audience, and I always love interviewing him. Really deep insights in Russia. What do you think is a potential end game, if there is an end game? Andrei Kortunov said, this was an on-the-record thing, he said, that what we see going on in Ukraine, what we see going on over this, is really the continuing repercussions and aftershocks of the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, the ongoing. And I found it a really interesting thing because I'm wondering to what degree the U.S. is going to have those same kind of aftershocks as its world shrinks. Now, you may disagree that it's shrinking, but a lot of people think America is going through a strategic contraction of some sort. But I'm interested in how you would identify, just as we go, before we go to the audience, you know, how, as you look at Russia, opportunities, obstacles ahead in its interaction in the dance it's doing Eastern Europe, if you're Ursula von der Leyen and you've laid down the gauntlet on this, you know, how many people are going to have to shift because of what just happened in the United States?
Lots. I mean, the crises of the post-Cold War period and the failures of American elite leadership, right? The Iraq War, the failure at state building in Afghanistan, the Great Recession, right? That brought Donald Trump to power. And Donald Trump has profoundly changed the foreign policy orientation of one of the two major American political parties. From a party that was committed to a muscular American involvement in the world, based not only on military strength, but also on multilateralism and economic engagement with the world, has now become a party of quasi-isolationists. And that's a profound change.
Jim, do you agree with Greg?
Well, I think Donald Trump has changed the nature of the conversation in the United States. But again, I think we have to wait and see what it is that Donald Trump now does. It's very easy on the campaign trail. You make promises, you make boasts. All of a sudden, you take the oath of office, you have the inbox. So on this question of Ukraine, what is it at the end of the day Donald Trump is going to seek to do? We have no sense of what his plan was. We're going to potentially find out. But we also don't know is what Russian President Putin's response to that is going to be. He just recently gave a speech where he made it clear he is not in a compromising mood, that if the United States is willing to capitulate, he is willing to accept the capitulation. Now, perhaps that is simply, pre-bargaining boast. You just do that to maximize your negotiating range. But maybe that's his real bottom line. One could imagine from a Russian point of view, looking at the facts on the ground, saying, this war is going our way. Why should I concede anything? So unless Donald Trump delivers what it is that I want, I'll just hold out. And we'll find out if that is the case, how would a Donald Trump as president respond? Because again, he's put a big marker that he's going to resolve this. He could do it, it's easy one day. And again, don't think that in the United States, politics ends at the water's edge. Democrats have been knocked back on their heels. They're going to start looking for anything they can start beating Donald Trump up about because they want to recover. Because the conversation in Washington, we've now gone through a week of sort of finger pointing in the circular firing squad among Democrats. They're soon going to begin turning to our next election in 2026 and thinking this is our way to really get back in the game.
Do you want to jump in there?
No, I'm good.
Just one last quick one. I talked to General Mark Milley, former commander of the Joint. He was
chairman of the Joint
Chiefs
Chiefs
Staff, and not a great fan of Donald Trump. But I asked Milley.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah, and I asked Milley how he felt about the professionalism of the combatant commanders in the highest level. He was wondering, because one of the real issues that one has is Donald Trump seems to be more prone, in language anyway, to consider deploying the U.S. military at home against enemies at home than deploying that military for achieving objectives abroad. It's the first time we've heard that kind of language from the U.S. President. Milley told me that's pretty much impossible given the command staff, but do you believe that?
Well, what I think General Milley is referring to is a law called Posse Comitatus, which was passed in the 1860s, which says you can't do it. I think there's some lawyers in Trump's orbit who will point back to the Insurrection Act of the early 1800s and argue that you can do it. But this takes us back, I think, to an overarching issue that surrounds the whole Trump presidency, which is how far, how fast, and how furious is he going to go in pushing his policy agenda. And I underline the furious part because he is clearly animated by grievances about how he was treated. He, as you said, Greg, thinks that General Milley has been guilty of treason. He has talked about bringing back generals and court-martialing them. He has talked about firing the senior levels of the United States military. And I would imagine that sense is now being fueled by stories, New York Times, I believe, and elsewhere, in which the Pentagon is getting together and talking about how they're going to, I won't use the word resist, but respond to a Trump presidency. Because again, there's a fundamental principle in the United States military of civilian control of the military. That's a rock-rib principle. But there's a second principle, which is that as a military officer, you're obliged to obey a legal military order. The question then comes down, what constitutes a legal military order? And I think this is what the senior military leadership is trying to figure out. They very much don't want to get swept up in a political maelstrom. They may not be able to. And again, we will see what kind of presidency Donald Trump will run. The first time through, there was a great deal of chaos, and it got limited because he was surrounded by, you remember, Steve, the great phrase, the axis of adults. You had General Mattis, you had Secretary of State Tillerson, Gary Cohn, and others who didn't share his worldview and tried to keep him from really doing things that they viewed as harmful to U.S. national interest. We may have a Trump team that is more interested in letting Trump be Trump this time around.
I think that's right. So you heard it here, folks. It's all going to get better. All right, let's go to the audience. We have Abdul Khalek Abdullah. Let's make it short. Let's kind of go through a big lightning round, try and get all these questions in. I don't know where you are. There he is, right here.
Right here, Steve. Yes. Very quick, if you allow me 3 questions for your distinguished panelist here. The first one is, we are still to fully digest the strong Trump comeback, at least over here, okay? So this is amazing in the sense that here is this guy, unpredictable, eccentric, whatever you want to call it. you have something like 74 million American of all sorts have voted for him. 74 plus million American. So can any one of you, Greg, right here, can any of the panelists please demystify for us this riddle called America, this riddle called Trump comeback? That's first question. Second question, if I may, can anyone also just tell us how would Trump handle the Gaza war, the 1 year plus war in Gaza, any differently from Biden? In what sense? In which way? Can you please elaborate on that? And the third and final one, Steve, if you may. Look, the conventional wisdom until very lately has been that America is in retreat, America is in decline, whatever. There is this new conventional wisdom, we just heard it from John and among others, John Altman, among others, that America is back. Is that really sinking in with you guys in the panel? Thank you very much.
Wonderful questions. Jim, why don't you take the question on...
Steve, can we take all the questions, then we back to the
Would you
panel?
like take a few questions together?
Please
Sure.
do.
Okay. How about Syed Sajadpour?
Me? No.
Yeah, there you go.
No. Thanks. It's a very interesting panel. Two questions. One very practical, the second is theoretical. On the practical level, we know Trump, he has a special ego of himself, and he can be manipulated based on his ego. With this introduction, can Netanyahu exploit him and pull him to a regional conflict which negates, of course, his promises, but the possibility of it should also be examined in the context of this psychological mood that he has. The second question is more theoretical, and that is the crisis of liberal hegemony. Can Trump really solve this maybe 3 decades old crisis of liberal hegemony after the Cold War? And to what extent he understands it and has a theoretical base?
I like that qualification, how much he understands it. Dalal Irakat.
Here. Well, thank you very much. This is Dalal Irakat from Palestine. I'm not offended as a Palestinian, as you say, Ukraine poses more of a priority to the US foreign policy rather than the Palestinians. But my question, we have tried Trump. He imposed the facts on the grounds on the Palestinian-Israeli realities. And when we talk about the normalization agreements and the Abraham Accords, we cannot only reframe them in the sense that they are an American, Emirati, or American Arab deals, because in the text, it spoke about the ending of annexation and, rights for the Palestinian people.
Just to clarify, you're saying in the text of the Abraham Accord?
Yes,
okay.
In the Emirati,
Right.
specifically the first agreements, it spoke about the ending of annexation.
Right.
On the ground, I don't think the Emiratis had benefited much. We all saw that the Abraham Accords did not bring their fruits. But my question, and because I want to be pragmatic and
right.
to practice empathy, if really Trump is concerned about the security, the strategic security of Israel in the region, you don't think that the Palestinian question should be a priority to the American administration? And my other comment is on the framing of Israel-Gaza war. Since this morning, I've been hearing this term. I want to correct the narrative and say that what we're facing there is a genocide. It is an a war against the Palestinian right to self-determination. Right. And it's very important on this sophisticated level of discussion that we don't neglect that there is an Israeli military occupation, an illegal military occupation that has been existing for more than 7 decades in Palestine, and that needs to end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's get last here, Sterling Jensen. Sterling?
Yes, thank you. Do you think that Gulf states will be able to remain neutral if great power competition heats up during the Trump administration? And will they be able to maintain this equidistant type of relationship between, for example, the United States and China or Russia?
Well, Russia's going to have a good time with the United States, but but we'll get into that. Okay, so we have a lot of good questions here, Jim. Let me come to this first of explaining the riddle of America. I have a few comments just real quick myself on this. Would love to get both of you very rapidly on these. But I'll tell you, my family's from Bartlesville, Oklahoma, a little bit north of Tulsa, Oklahoma, not part of the northeastern liberal establishment that a lot of Americans don't like right now, where all of Jim's friends live. No, I'm just joking. But if you're out there and you're kind of with people who feel, and it's been building for a long time, they feel they were not part of the fast track in America. They were demeaned. I tell you, humiliation in the sense that you've been humiliated by other people is a major driver of behavior in foreign affairs, but also in domestic political choices. And you have a huge number of Americans who don't want better policies out of Washington. They want to destroy Washington because they feel like it has wrecked them, particularly the 2008-2009 financial crisis, where the American economy, supposed to be the creme de la creme capitalism, turned out to be pretty corrupt. And they ended up paying the price for that, while they saw in bailed out financial firms in New York, over 5,000 people at these firms that were bailed out by taxpayers had $1 million or more bonuses within 1 year. That sense of unfairness has driven a lot of rage and anger, and it has nowhere to go. And that's what I would add. But Jim, your thoughts?
Well, first I just want to say, forgive me for my poor manners, I want to thank Dr. Ebtisam for organizing this wonderful conference and giving me the opportunity to come here to the Gulf to meet all of the wonderful people in the audience and to chat with you, Steve, and you, Greg. I want to begin. You grew up in Oklahoma. I went to college in Michigan, and I taught in Iowa for 12 years. So I have lived in flyover land, as it's called, and I think what you point to is quite right. People were quite angry for lots of reasons. What I will say about sort of the Trump comeback, one thing to keep in mind is that virtually every incumbent government that was up for re-election in 2024, the so-called mother of election years, lost.
Right.
And there's, I think, a general thing, take away the specifics of America, where people are unhappy for a variety of reasons. They believe their governments are failing them, and in essence, they pulled the lever to say, get rid of these bums, bring in somebody new.
Right. Quick thought, 30 seconds?
No, I'm good on that. We can go
Okay,
on
let me ask you about the Gaza war and conflict, where that is. How would Trump be different?
I don't think Trump will be different. I think the rhetoric will be different in that I don't think that we'll get the rhetorical flourishes that we had from the Biden people about care about Palestinian civilian deaths and things like that. I just don't think that we're going to see that. But on the ground, I don't think the policy toward Gaza is going to be any different at all.
But do you see any circumstance in which Donald Trump would put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to end the fighting, whether in Gaza or in southern Lebanon?
No.
Okay.
And I just say, Tony Blinken has been in this, back and forth a zillion times. Whoever is Secretary of State in the next administration is not going to make those bilateral trips.
I mean, I think the one place where Trump might put pressure on Netanyahu is on Iran.
Jim, is the U.S. back or the U.S. in decline?
I'm not sure what U.S. being back means. When Joe Biden won in 2020, we heard America is back over and over again. What I would say is that if you were thinking of world politics as a game of poker, the United States has a lot of very good cards in its hand. It has a robust economy. It has great innovation, great schools. For all of the fraying of American soft power, it's still significant. The real question comes down to how well will America play its hand? And again, there are reasons to be very concerned about the choices that Donald Trump will make. But again, I don't want to prejudge the administration before it's staffed and begun to actually operate.
America's back in semiconductor chips, but maybe not in a lot of other things. So we'll get there. I love this question. Let's see. We've got my friend on looking at Trump's ego and whether it's easy to manipulate him through an ego. What's your sense, Jim? Could Bibi Netanyahu flatter Trump into a broader war and conflict in the Middle East?
Donald Trump clearly likes flattery. One can point out most of us do. However, I think when you look at Donald Trump, what matters more than other people's flattery is Donald Trump's worldview. and that is pretty clear. And I would imagine that many American friends, partners, and allies are going to feel the brunt of his irritation that they're not doing enough, and if they don't do more for the United States, he's going to walk. And I think in particular, you're going to see an awful lot of pressure brought to bear on America's European friends.
And Saeed, I would also say go back and do a quick search in the media for reports a while back of how irritated Trump was with Netanyahu. Right now, it's a love fest that's being reported by everybody, but that's not really the core. These are two alpha males that at various times hate each other and have hated each other over issues. So I'm not defending Trump in any way, and I think the flattery issue's there, but it's also wrong to think it's just been an easy ride for Netanyahu with Trump.
But there's nothing that President Trump likes more than having a critic come and bend the knee, apologize to him, and promise to support him. Just look at his vice president.
Gregory, does he worry about liberal hegemony?
No, and but I think that this whole
But let's just say,
idea,
not just about Trump, but his people.
no, I don't think they do. But Saeed Kazim, I think that the liberal world order is ending because power is shifting, right? And I think that that is true no matter who the president of the United States is.
But in this case, it's important to keep in mind that Donald Trump has never believed in liberal hegemony. His whole argument is the world is a dog-eat-dog place.
Right.
And we were kind of naive and thought that we could go out and build these structures and people would support us. And in his view, not my view, his view, in essence, all our friends, partners, and allies did was steal from us.
And to Dalal's question, which I would just sort of put it there, in this ongoing tension in foreign policy between interests and values or morality, why isn't and can't there be a stronger case for Palestine being higher up the ladder of significant concerns of the United States into the future? Jim?
Well, I think there are lots of reasons. One is you can look back over the course of American foreign policy, certainly over the last 30 years. If you're in the Clinton administration, as I was, they poured an awful lot of time, effort, and hopes in trying to do a deal. Never were able to make it happen. A lot of reasons for that, but I also think in many ways in the American public's mind, the Palestinians, if you watch the news, what is happening in Gaza is horrific, but people are also reminded of what happened on October 7th, and they're reminded of that continually. And the real question of whether or not Palestinians are willing to live with the Israelis. And I think if you look at the vast majority of Americans, their answer is Palestinians aren't. And until that perception changes.
And Talal, I would love to talk to you more about it because I actually do think it's very important, but I would also, I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of hate mail from the room in this, but I also look at the Arab region and I say, what are you doing? Where does Palestine fit on? I hear King Abdullah of Jordan's comments, and I really respect his foreign minister, but they're not ripping up a peace deal. They're not, when you kind of look at your leverage points, the question is, what are other major players in the region bringing to that conflict? I know the United States, in my view, has been derelict in that, but that's my own personal view. But I think
can I do Gulf state neutrality, which I think is a fascinating thing?
Yeah.
I think that the Gulf states are playing a very sophisticated hedging game here, and we have to look at issue areas. On economic issues, the Gulf states are not going to sign on to some kind of exclusive American umbrella. They want to deal with China. They want to deal with, they have to deal with Russia if you want to manage the world oil market. And so hedging on economics. On military security, it seems like, to me, the Gulf states are very, very willing to sign on to an American-led military order, if you will, for their own security. So I think we should look at Gulf state neutrality issue by issue. I think that's the way they do.
Well, I also think for the Trump administration, there's a temptation to exaggerate how much leverage the United States has in various parts of the world, including this one.
Yeah.
And I think whether here in Abu Dhabi or in Riyadh, there may be efforts to show that they're not helpless and have levers in agency of their own. So I think it'd be a very interesting
The problem here, and I know I'm standing between you and lunch, very briefly. The problem here is most Americans think if we have a military alliance with somebody, they should back us on everything else. And I think that that is something that might disappoint Americans. not just with our Gulf allies, but with other countries around the world. India, we heard that.
Let me ask, we have not mentioned the term BRICS at all in this discussion, but do you believe that alternative organizations, alternative clubs out there, and I think both of you talked about the proclivity of the United States to use the SWIFT system, and it's created a lot of negativity in the world, I have to tell you. People want to get rid of the reserve currency status of the dollar. They want to get around it, over-sanctioning or the sense of over-sanctioning. And you see an enthusiasm kind of out there to figure out how can we bring America, how we can deliver of humility to America and some of this stuff. Do you think the BRICS matter or not? Do you think these alternative organizations, because I think, to come back to your earlier point, Greg, I think in the world that we're going into, these kinds of organizations make it harder for the United States to get global total pressure on someone. They're all hedging their bets. They don't buy our story as much. But tell me where I'm wrong.
I think BRICS could be, but they're not there yet. Interesting to note, Saudi Arabia was invited to join the BRICS. They haven't done it yet. They go as an observer, not as a member.
Yeah.
One thing just to point out about the BRICS is there's considerable division within the BRICS about what it should aspire to do. And I will note that Prime Minister Modi at the most recent meeting put a marker down and said we should not view this organization as an effort to create new institutions, but an effort to reform existing ones. And I think, again, the interests of BRIC countries don't entirely align. They're going to fight. But I wanted to ask Greg a question, just sort of thinking about the Trump administration. There was a lot of talk in the Biden administration of crafting a security compact with Saudi Arabia. And I think there were particularly a lot of optimism, let's say in September of 2003, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, was waxing poetic about it. Is that gone? Will we see a Trump administration seek to revive it?
Why would Saudi Arabia sign a security agreement with a Biden administration that's about to go out of power when a Trump administration is about to
but with the
come in?
Trump administration, I guess is my question.
No, I think it's possible, but I think the Biden administration made a habit of misreading Saudi Arabia. And I think that this, to the point of what has the region done for Palestine? I mean, I do think that the current Gaza war has upped the ante of what Saudi Arabia will require if it is going to do this trilateral deal with the United States and Israel.
And it's final 2 minutes here. When I think back to some of the great foreign policy architects in U.S. history, and not just foreign policy, economic policy, Morgenthau, John Foster Dulles in intelligence and others, Dean Acheson, Kissinger, Nitze, George Kennan, and others of this sort.
James A. Baker III and
James
George H.W. Bush, whose school
Texas.
I teach in.
Yes, from James A. Baker, of course.
Yeah.
But it begs the question when you see, and it gets back to the point of America trying to preserve its place in the world, this reluctance to really reform institutions, and like the P5 and the UN or others, where you see institutions that are misaligned with the way power is evolving in the world. Does that break at some point? Does everything just fall and collapse because it's no longer relevant? I mean,
Steve, do you want to take the French veto away?
Yeah, I think Greg just put his finger on something.
Address your letters to Steve.
No, but I think there's a tendency to think that something doesn't happen is the U.S. fault. There's the reason these institutions don't get reformed because a lot of the players have no interest in seeing things change. Or put it differently, they may want to change it, but they can't agree on what change will work. Everybody says that UN Security Council should be reformed. None of the P5 are willing to give that up. They may say nice things in public. In private, it is no way, because that is to cede status or to lose status.
Look, there's a lot we didn't get into. Erdogan of Turkey, what's going on with, we talked a little bit about India, but India's out there. I mean, all of the kind of interesting strategic surfers, Lula in Brazil, and when you kind of look at the surf out there, it's, very complex. But it's interesting that everything around the world becomes a lot more interesting if the U.S. is not dominating everything, and I don't think it will. And it's an interesting thing to see Donald Trump enthusiastically retreating from a lot of these commitments that the U.S. used to derive its sense of place and purpose and power in the world, and that's what I'm hearing from both of you. So I really want to thank Dr. F. Gregory Gause of the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, and of course Jim Lindsay from the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you both very much, and thank you to all of you. Let's go have lunch.